Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tonellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. Today, I get to introduce you to another fabulous writer that I think Australia can claim as one of its own. Her father was a racing driver, so growing up, she spent half her year in Australia and the other half in either the UK or America. Later, whilst working as a reviews editor for a UK magazine, this author signed her first publishing deal. Since 2007, she has released an incredible 15 novels, along with a 3-part spin-off series for young adults, as well as a collection of short stories. Her books, set in different locations around the world, have sold more than 1.5 million copies globally. Her latest novel, Someone I Used to Know, was released here in Australia in June 2021 by Penguin. And I have to tell you, listeners, this book was an absolute joy to read from start to finish. Oh my, it was heartbreaking and heartwarming all at once. Tender, passionate and romantic to boot. I simply could not put it down. Set in North Yorkshire, an area I have longed to visit since reading Wuthering Heights as a teenager, this book set my imagination on fire and my pulse racing. So it is with such very great pleasure that I welcome Paige Toon to the podcast today. Hi, Paige.
Hello. Hi, how are you? Thank you for having me.
Paige, Someone I Used to Know was such a beautiful read. I totally loved all three of your main characters, Leah, George and Theo, and I certainly didn't see that plot twist coming. So I wanted to ask you, Paige, what inspired you to write this story?
I wanted to write a story about a girl who had grown up with her parents being the foster parents. So she's their biological daughter. The idea just occurred to me, how unusual that would be to be living in a household full of all these troubled teenagers who come and go, and, what that would be like if your parents were the ones looking after them, to have to share your parents. And in doing my research, I discovered really heartbreakingly that it's not uncommon at all for siblings to be separated, often with the younger ones being put up for adoption and the older children being put into care. So that just broke my heart. So I wanted to kind of shine the light on this situation, and that's what happens with George. Leah is my main character. Her parents, are foster parents. They specialise in looking after the younger teenagers, which I also discovered through research that are the most difficult to place. The younger kids, I think, are easier to place because, they're not quite as much hard work, I guess. And the older teenagers are easier to place because they're not going to be in the care system for too long. So it's not like a long-term commitment. But I did discover that it was the sort of younger teenagers that, it was really hard to place them. So I kind of wanted to write really inspirational foster parents who, their focus is mostly on these kids. And George is one of these kids who comes into Leah's life. But the story is very much told in 2 timelines, which I'm sure you'll go on to say, but when they're 15 and when they're 30. So the present day is when they're adults. So this is not a young adult book, is all I'm trying to say.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Just picking up on what you've just said, I was completely invested in these characters, but also so completely inspired by the spotlight that you shone on foster caring and the amazing work that foster carers do. You touched a little bit on it, but why was it important for you to write about this?
Like I say, the idea came to me, and then once I started doing my research, I just got very, very emotionally, involved with the idea. I found this by far my most emotional book for me to write because of the looked after children angle, like that. To do all of that research, and obviously all of the stories in this book are fictional, but they're all realistic. Anything like this could have happened to any number of children out there. I just felt very, very connected to it. And as it went on, I just discovered more and more and just wanted to, like I say, shine a light. And I thought if there was, any chance, I've had so many readers write to me over the years telling me that they have been inspired to do a career that I might have written about, or, go and visit places I've written about and things like that. And I just thought, if there was any chance whatsoever that one person would be inspired to foster after reading this book, that would just be my proudest achievement, I think. But also just through doing the research, I discovered how easy it is to do other things. Like fostering might not be the right thing for you to do, but, just how important it is for people to support other foster carers, or let your kids play with foster children, or take a meal to someone, or lend an ear to a social worker who might be had enough, basically, and maybe need someone to offload onto. There's so much that anyone can do to sort of help this situation and make it better for these poor kids who, have had such a rough ride.
Before we get too far down the track, for those who haven't read this book yet, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about the story.
So this is the story, as you mentioned, of Leah, George and Theo. They meet when they're 15. Theo is the son of a local wealthy landowner. So he sort of should be at boarding school, but on the same day that Leah meets George, Theo also gets onto their state school bus on the way to school. And over the course of the summer, the three of them become unbreakable, like this really strong pair. Theo has his own issues with love and care at home. He's not in a loving household. So, Leah just is very protective of both of them. But she falls for George. And that's the other thing. I like to write about sort of impossible love stories. That's the thing that intrigues me the most when I'm writing. And it would be impossible for Leah to have a relationship with George. He's living under her roof, and if her parents found out that she, had feelings for him, then there might be a chance that he would get moved on. They've always tried to avoid having kids who are her age before, for reasons like this. So, it broadened this idea of this sort of forbidden love story, this chemistry and being able to write about that. But in the present day, the characters are 30. It opens with a prologue. It's her parents' retirement party, and Leah is married to Theo, and they have a daughter, and it's in the future. And then something happens at the end of the prologue, which kind of, is a real game changer. And you don't discover what that is until so further on down the line. But when Leah returns to Yorkshire in the now section, she has her daughter and Theo's not with them. And at that point, George comes back into her life. So again, a little bit of an impossible love story, but, there are a few twists and turns along the way. A few things might take you by surprise.
Indeed, well, they certainly took me by surprise, as I mentioned before. Now, Leah was definitely her parents' child. Ivan and Carrie were, as I've said before, inspirational characters with their commitment to caring for teenagers who end up in the foster system. But as their only biological child, I thought Leah was mature and empathetic and emotionally intelligent, even as a young girl. So as you said, we get to see her when she was 15 through the then chapters and then as an adult in the now chapters. So I wanted to ask you, was she inspired by a real life person?
Initially, no. Initially I sort of had this idea that she would be a, fairly compassionate teenager. I didn't want her to be too bratty. Obviously, she gets a little bit bitter at some points, and she finds it difficult, She says, this one quite early on, it's hard sharing her parents with kids who undoubtedly need her parents more. So, that's hard because she needs them too, and sometimes I'm not always there for her. But during my research, my foster care research, I spoke to a foster carer, and I also spoke to her daughter, who's now an adult. And she was talking about how much she looked up to her mum, and how much her mum inspired her, and how proud she was of her mum. So even though she had the same struggles that Leah had, Leah is very much a realistic character because, she does sort of reflect, this person who actually lived through a similar scenario.
Yes, indeed. And so that brings me to ask you about Leah's parents. And obviously, you have spoken to foster parents in the course of your research. So did you model Carrie and Ivan on anyone in particular?
No, they were, I really wanted them to be inspirational, but I did read an article where I read so much, did so much internet research. And I do remember reading this one article where someone said that they went, into a foster home. And I think their social worker had said, you make sure you're good, or don't misbehave, or don't do something. And this, the foster dad said to him, son will take you as you are. And I loved that. So I wrote that into the story, that Ivan, is very much this sort of strong, dad who's just very compassionate, and they're very understanding, and they're not trying to sort of mold these kids. I mean, it must be absolutely terrifying, being taken away from your home and your family and your pets and your toys and your neighborhood and your classmates and everything, ripped away from everything that and suddenly sort of thrust into this completely strange house and just expected to get on. Of course you're gonna rebel and have difficulties there. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of like hopefully make people understand a little bit more and have a bit more compassion if there's some looked after kids in their school or any sort of situation like that. I was sort of hoping it might kind of inspire people to be a bit more empathetic.
Both Theo and George, as you've mentioned, were broken boys, despite coming from such different backgrounds. I wanted to ask, how were you able to capture their vulnerabilities and insecurities so vividly?
Well, for me, as soon as I'm inside a character's head, which I'm inside Leah's, I'm telling the story from her perspective, she feels very real to me. And when I'm writing, I just feel so kind of deeply connected to the characters. I write my books in, quite a short time, but I've been thinking about them for a long time in advance. So they feel really real by the time I come to write them. And because I'm so sort of, like I say, I write in September, October and November in the UK, and that's where I'm based at the moment. And I just feel really kind of deeply connected to the story for that short amount of time. So the characters just feel real, and it's realism is really important to me, which is why my stories are not always predictable. Sometimes you don't necessarily get the happy ending you're expecting because that doesn't feel real. When I've kind of done all the research and really thought about it, like there have been times when it hasn't. It's been quite bittersweet. Things aren't all like tied up neatly all the time. I try to be realistic as much as possible. So I guess just from being inside Leah's head and having her see these boys, then they do become well-rounded characters. I have been thinking about them for a long time, and yeah, it's just the way I write.
So much of what made this book also come alive for me were the real life places that you detailed in the book. Brimham Rocks, is that the way you say it? And Ripon are two such examples. What drew you to the setting for this story?
I love Yorkshire. I love Yorkshire, and I love North Yorkshire, which is where this story is set. The Dales and the Yorkshire moors. My husband is a Yorkshireman. he and his parents, still live in East Yorkshire. And every time, for the last 25 years, I've been going up to Yorkshire, and we'll always go and visit amazing, beautiful places. And this story is dedicated to my parents, to my parents-in-law, who have just sort of shown me so many places in Yorkshire. And in fact, my father-in-law used to be a deputy head at a secondary school, and they would always do this residential trip to this place called Spires Bank, which was this house sort of out at, in Yorkshire. I think it was in the moors. Might be in the Dales actually. And they used to go to this place with all these kids, but the really sort of badly behaved children would never be allowed to go. And he thought that was wrong. And so he would take them on a separate trip, like he would take them, so they still got to go, even though, the other teachers couldn't handle them, he would still always take these kids. And, years later, these boys would sort of see him on the street, and would kind of say, thank you so much, for still taking us, Mr. Toon, we really, really appreciate it. And so that kind of inspired it a little bit too, the way that he was quite inspirational. So I just absolutely love this setting. Brimham Rocks is one of my favourite places in the world. It's just this incredible landscape of these amazing big rocks, these sort of boulders kind of, you should just Google it, coming out of this landscape of heather and ferns. And I went up there with my husband at the end of August last year just to do one last big research trip, and spend some time there and walk all around. And we walked right to the outskirts and, looking down at all the farms and, worked out which one would be Leah's farm. And in this rock, I found this is just a really funny story, I found this heart-shaped hole and took a photograph of it. I've put it on my Instagram page if anyone wants to see it, Paige Toon author. And earlier this year, a couple of weeks ago, I reached out to the person who did the narration for the audiobook for someone I used to know. Yeah. I just wanted to say thank you to her because I've heard from so many people saying what a great job she's done on this. And she wrote back to me and said, you wouldn't believe it, but when I came to read this book and you talked about this hole, look at this picture. She found this same sort of heart-shaped hole. Like I say, it's right on the outskirts. It's not in the main part at all. She must have been wandering out in exactly the same space that we were wandering. And she took a photograph of this heart-shaped hole, just thought it was, such a coincidence.
Well, I did see that picture. Of course, immediately finishing the book, started to Google Brimham Rocks and wanted to know where they were. So, obviously I'm planning my next trip to the UK. So I need to find all these spots that you mention in the book, which I'm so enamoured by. And yes, it's the most incredibly striking geological formations, which I'd never seen before, almost like cans of rocks, but naturally formed. They're just incredible.
There's one called Druid's Idol, which is this absolutely massive, massive rock. It must be like, I don't know, 1.5 to 2 stories high, and it's resting on this tiny point. It's just like, it looks like it's balanced on this tiny little point, like lifted off the ground. It's crazy.
It is crazy. Paige, as I mentioned in my introduction, you've set your books in many varied locations around the world. So I wondered, what comes first for you? Is it setting or character?
It's a bit of both. It can be either. Sometimes, obviously the setting has to work for the story. Usually I've got the idea for the book, and then at that point we're kind of like, where should we go on our next family holiday? And then I'll try to work that into the story somehow. But it needs to work, like The Longest Holiday is set in Key West in Florida, and it needed to be something like that, that sort of, climate. And, the character of Leo, he comes from Cuba, initially, and I needed someone like that. And so, yeah, it just depends, it depends on the story or where, like I say, where I want to set my next family holiday.
I love that. I'm going to take a leaf out of your book. That's what I'm going to do.
But also, if I've been to a nice location, I love to write from experience. So if I've been, or if I'm going to a nice location, which has nothing to do with the books, then I will try and write that into the book somehow. And that happened with The Last Piece of My Heart. I went on this beautiful family holiday with my parents, my brother and his family to Thailand. And it was just such a gorgeous, I was like, right, this needs to somehow be incorporated. And that just works, works for the story. It starts off in Cornwall, but she does go to Thailand for a big chunk of it, to research a book of her own. So
alpaca farming is something that is gaining popularity in many places. Here in Australia, they're farmed for their meat along with their wool. And Leah's family side business of alpaca wool and breeding is an entertaining subplot, not only as a money-making venture, but as therapy for the troubled kids that come into Leah's family. Was this something you consciously wanted to write about?
Not to start with. I had this idea of them all working on a farm, and I liked the idea of the kids helping out on the farm. I thought that would be good for them, and especially if they're kids who are coming from a city to suddenly be thrust into this rural location. I thought that would be a nice backdrop for the story. But in North Yorkshire, they don't have farms that just are, crop farms or anything like that. And so it's all meat farming. And that just didn't really fit for the storyline. I couldn't really imagine, looked after children having to then be working on a farm where the animals will go and get slaughtered. It didn't sit right with me. So I was talking to my mother-in-law about it, and she suggested alpaca farming. And I thought, oh my God, alpacas, I love alpacas. And very, very strangely, after I'd done the research on alpacas with a lady who lives locally to me in Cambridge in the UK, I then found out there is an alpaca farm right on the outskirts of Brimham Rock. So I made sure to mention that in the acknowledgements, because I didn't want them thinking that I was basing my story on them.
Yeah, fantastic. So Carrie ends up creating a bit of a knitting circle later on in the book. And so I wondered, are you a knitter? Is that something you're interested in?
No, I don't knit. I don't knit at all. But what happened is, when I went to go and do the research for the alpacas, the lady who I spoke to, she has a knitting workshop, and she does very, very similar things to how I've mentioned it in the book. And she was talking to me about it, and I thought, well, this would work really, really nicely. And then she was also we were talking about I was telling her about the looked after children and, how I wanted them to help. And she was saying how therapeutic it is to spin wool, just sort of sitting there, and it kind of, it sort of calms sort of quiet, sort of busy minds and stuff. And so that idea developed, and then, I ended up writing in Angora bunnies as well, because the kids can sort of sit there and sort of pluck the fur, and plucking sounds sort of awful, but it's just basically sort of pulling out pieces of fur, tufts of fur that are coming loose, molting naturally. So I just thought that was just a nice kind of thing to work into the story. And then, it does sort of work with the later section too, where Carrie's mum sort of goes on to do these knitting workshops.
Okay, so Paige, what would you like most for readers to take away from this book?
Well, I think ultimately, there's a lot of emotion in this book. I think you will feel emotion, but I hope you will also feel very uplifted. I think it's a sort of book that, it's ultimately a love story, but there's so much to do with family and love and care, written into it. And more than anything, as I said earlier, if anyone felt inspired to foster or to help, another foster family or a social worker in some sort of small way, or get involved with kids who might need help, that would be 100% my proudest achievement. So that would be the thing that I hope for. But I'll wait and see if it's happened. I have heard from a lot of people who've read this who do work in the care sector, and have felt really moved by it, and said that it was realistic. It was good to have people kind of understand, what it's like kind of behind the scenes. So that makes me feel really proud too.
Yeah, I'm sure it would. As the author of more than 15 books, I wondered if you had any advice for aspiring writers who might listen to this podcast.
For me, it's write what you love, not what you think you should. Imagine no one else is going to read it. Write for yourself and just try to get to the end. I give great advice. I don't take my own advice. I will spend forever on the first 20,000. It takes me forever to get to, the first 20,000, and then the rest of the book kind of flows a bit easier. I think if you can get to the end of a book, you can edit it at the end, but you can't edit nothing. So you need to just press on. And if you can write without reading the beginning, I think it would be the best thing you could possibly do for yourself, just because you will rip it to shreds and you'll be so doubtful of yourself, or you might be anyway. Maybe you'll be confident, that would be great. But I think to get to the end, you'll become such a great writer on that journey that by the time, you reach the end, you're a different writer to how you were when you started. So you can sort out the beginning at a later date. So yeah, but most importantly, write what you love, write for yourself. If you love what you're writing, guaranteed there are readers out there who love it too.
If listeners wanted to find you, where could they do that?
I'm on social media. I'm on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter at Paige Toon Author. My website's paigetoon.com, and I have a newsletter called The Hidden Page, which you can sign up to. Sometimes I send out free short stories and there's competitions and things like that. You get like cover reveals, exclusive sort of, content. And so you can sign up to that at paigetoon.com.
Paige, I absolutely loved Someone I Used to Know. I can't wait to read more of your novels. Thank you so much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudineteinellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.